The nights were always the hardest. When the city's noise finally quieted down, and the lights went out one by one in the windows surrounding his apartment, Michael's mind would start to race. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he found himself overwhelmed by a flood of thoughts. They weren't just memories. They were speculations. What if he had taken that job? What if he had stayed in that relationship? What if he had said yes when the world seemed to be pushing him to say no? The possibilities haunted him, making him feel as if somewhere between the choices made and not made, he had lost himself. Michael had always thought of himself as a practical man, or at least that's how he liked to see himself. The kind of person who made decisions based on logic, on what seemed like the safest route at the time. But over the years, a growing sense of regret had settled in his chest, as though with each decision, he had turned away from a better, more meaningful life. Lately, that regret had become an obsession. He frequently found himself replaying moments when life presented him with crossroads, paths he didn't take, choices he left behind. What would have happened if he had accepted that job offer in another city? What if he had been braver in the relationships he walked away from, fearing failure? He didn't know, but the weight of these unanswered questions consumed him. Michael never spoke to anyone about this. Not to friends, not to family. After all, deep regrets weren't the kind of thing one casually brought up in daily conversation, and he didn't want to seem ungrateful for the life he had. But deep down, there was a part of him that believed he had lost something important along the way. Something irretrievable. One night, unable to sleep once again, Michael decided to go for a walk. It was a temporary escape from the relentless pressure of his own thoughts, or so he hoped. Walking through the empty streets of the city helped clear his mind, and he often found himself drawn to the quieter, forgotten areas. On those solitary walks, the streets seemed to hold secrets, and he liked the feeling of being off the radar, where no one knew him or judged him. That night, as he wandered without a clear destination, something caught his eye. A narrow side street he had never noticed before. Curious, he followed the path, and at the end of it, he found something completely unexpected. An old wooden door, intricately carved, that seemed out of place. There were no signs, no indication that anyone had been there in years. Just that door, like a relic forgotten by time. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing the cool, rough surface of the wood. A part of him knew he should turn back, but something about that door drew him in, almost irresistibly. It was as if, for some reason, it had been waiting for him. Without thinking too much, he turned the handle, and the door creaked open with a soft, almost welcoming sound. As Michael stepped through the door, he was immediately greeted by the unmistakable scent of age, a mix of old wood and even older books. Soft light filtered through dusty windows, casting a warm glow on rows upon rows of towering bookshelves. He looked around in awe. This wasn't just any library. It felt endless, as if it stretched far beyond what the small exterior had suggested, with books as far as his eyes could see. The air had a peculiar, almost magical quality, making everything feel surreal. He wandered deeper into the library, running his fingers along the spines of the books as he passed. Each one was neatly aligned, untouched by time. But the titles, they were strange. The Road Not Taken, The Door Left Closed, The Forgotten Decision. Vague, almost poetic, yet each one struck a chord within him, resonating with some deep part of his past. It was as though these books knew him, knew the choices he had made, or not made. Then something caught his attention. At the center of the room, on an old dark wooden table, lay a single open book. Unlike the others, this one seemed to be waiting for him. Drawn to it, Michael approached the table slowly. He peered down at the pages, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. The words on the page described in exact detail a choice he had made years ago. It was the decision to turn down a job offer in a different city. He remembered that moment vividly, the uncertainty, the fear of leaving behind the familiar, and the logical reasoning that made him stay. He had convinced himself that it was the right choice, the safer one. But even now, the thought of it lingered in the back of his mind. A quiet what if that never went away. Michael read on, his heart pounding. The book described what would have happened if he had taken that job. He saw himself moving to a new city, starting fresh in a new career, meeting new people. At first, it was exciting. The challenges of the job, the adventure of being somewhere completely new. But as the story unfolded, it became clear that the path he didn't take had its own struggles. There were financial difficulties, feelings of isolation, and setbacks he hadn't anticipated. He closed the book abruptly, his hands shaking slightly. What was this place? How could a book describe his life? Or rather, a life he hadn't lived? And more importantly, why was it showing him that even the choices he had idealized weren't as perfect as he had imagined? Michael stepped back from the table, his mind racing. It wasn't just the eeriness of the situation that unsettled him. It was the realization that this library, this strange, endless place, held the stories of all the choices he hadn't made. Each book on the shelves contained a different version of his life, based on the roads he didn't travel, the decisions he didn't make. The idea both thrilled and terrified him. He had come here searching for answers, for a way to reconcile his regrets. But now, standing in this vast library, surrounded by all the possibilities he had left behind, he wasn't sure if he truly wanted to know what each of those lives held. Michael glanced at the shelves again. The urge to explore more was overwhelming. He needed to understand what this place was trying to show him. He needed to know if somewhere among these countless stories, there was a life that was better than the one he was living now. Without thinking, he reached for another book and opened it. As Michael opened the next book, the sense of curiosity overwhelmed his growing apprehension. This book, too, pulled him into a version of his life that never came to be. The story on the pages took him back to a moment that had always lingered in his thoughts. The time when he had walked away from his dream of becoming a musician. Music had once been his passion, something he lived for. But the practicalities of life led him to abandon it in favor of a more stable career. But in this version, he didn't give up. The book described a path where he pursued music relentlessly. He joined a band, performed at small rundown venues, and spent years struggling to make ends meet. It was far from glamorous, nights spent sleeping in cramped vans, working odd jobs to support his passion, and facing rejection after rejection from record labels. Yet, there was also joy, a raw satisfaction in the pursuit of something he loved, despite the sacrifices it required. Michael felt himself getting lost in the narrative, imagining what it might have been like to follow that path. He could almost hear the music, feel the excitement of performing in front of an audience, even if it was just a small crowd in a dimly lit bar. There were moments of triumph, of connection with others who shared his passion. But as the years passed in this alternate life, the challenges grew. The band eventually split up. The dream of fame and success never fully materialized, leaving him struggling to find a new direction. He closed the book with a heavy sigh. He had always assumed that choosing music over practicality would have led to a more fulfilling life. Yet, even in this version, the road was hard, filled with disappointments and sacrifices. It wasn't the picture-perfect fantasy he had imagined. The joy came with pain, and the success he had hoped for remained elusive. Michael looked around at the countless shelves. Every book represented a different choice, a different life he could have lived, and each one seemed to contain both moments of joy and struggle, just like the life he had now. There was no easy path, no road free of challenges. The realization made his chest tighten. Was there no version of his life that led to perfect happiness? Determined to keep searching, Michael reached for another book. This time, it was about a relationship he had walked away from years ago. Sarah, the woman he had loved but let go of, fearing the commitment. The story unfolded with vivid clarity. In this alternate life, Michael chose to stay with her. They built a life together, navigating the ups and downs of a long-term relationship. At first, it was everything he had once dreamed of. They traveled together, shared moments of deep connection, and supported each other through life's challenges. But as time went on, the relationship faced its own struggles. Arguments about career choices, the pressures of starting a family, and the inevitable wear and tear of time. There were beautiful moments, yes, but also painful ones. The life they built together was not without its cracks. When Michael finished reading, he felt a wave of melancholy wash over him. He had always thought that staying with Sarah might have been the key to a happier life. But even in that version, there were difficulties, compromises, and losses. It wasn't the idyllic picture he had imagined all these years. Each book he read chipped away at the idealized versions of the life he thought he had missed. He began to see a pattern. No matter the choice, no matter the path, there was no such thing as a perfect life. Every road came with its own set of struggles, and every decision led to challenges that were impossible to avoid. As Michael placed the book back on the shelf, he felt the weight of the library pressing down on him. The shelves stretched on, filled with stories he was beginning to realize might not hold the answers he was seeking. Was he destined to find the same balance of joy and sorrow, no matter what choice he made? Despite the growing sense of dread, he couldn't stop. There had to be more. There had to be a path where everything fell into place. Or so he hoped. He reached for another book, knowing it might reveal the same truth, but unable to resist the urge to keep searching. Michael's pace quickened as he moved from shelf to shelf, pulling out books, reading fragments, and putting them back in frustration. The library, which at first had felt like a source of answers, was beginning to feel like a maze, one that led him deeper into confusion with every page he turned. He had imagined that by reading these alternate lives, he would find clarity, a sense of direction. Instead, each story seemed to echo the same message. No matter what choice he made, there would always be hardships. There was no escape from struggle. He grabbed a book detailing a choice he made to stay in his hometown after college, rejecting an opportunity to move to a bigger city for work. He had always wondered what might have happened if he had taken the leap. The story in the book revealed a life where Michael embraced the change, packed his bags, and left everything familiar behind. At first, that life seemed promising. He found himself in a fast-paced career, surrounded by new people and opportunities. There was excitement in the unknown, a thrill in starting over in a city that buzzed with energy. But soon, the challenges mounted. The loneliness of being away from family and friends began to weigh on him. The pressures of the job increased, leading to long hours and sleepless nights. He struggled to make meaningful connections, and the initial excitement gave way to isolation and burnout. Once again, Michael found himself facing the realization that even the life he had idealized, the one he always thought he should have chosen, was filled with its own unique difficulties. He had believed that moving away would have solved his problems, opened up a world of endless possibilities. But now, he saw that no path was free from challenges. He slammed the book shut, his frustration bubbling over. It didn't matter which book he picked, which life he read about. The theme was always the same. Every choice, every path, led to both joy and pain, to both fulfillment and loss. There was no perfect life, no decision that could shield him from suffering. The library felt more suffocating now. The shelves seemed to loom over him, mocking his desperate search for answers. His hands trembled as he pulled another book off the shelf, barely glancing at its title before flipping it open. This one recounted a version of his life where he had started his own business, something he had always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue. In this life, he saw himself taking a risk, pouring his heart and soul into building a company from the ground up. The early years were difficult, with financial struggles and endless work hours, but eventually, success came. His business grew, and with it, his sense of accomplishment. But as the years passed, the weight of responsibility began to crush him. Managing employees, maintaining the business, and keeping up with the demands of a constantly changing market took its toll. The success he had once dreamed of now felt like a burden, and the stress began to erode his health and relationships. Michael let out a shaky breath, feeling as though the library itself was playing a cruel trick on him. Each life he read about started with promise, with the hope that this time, things would be different. But the same patterns emerged again and again. The highs were inevitably followed by lows, and every achievement came with its own price. He looked around at the rows of books that stretched endlessly into the distance. How many more lives could he read before he accepted the truth? He had come to this place thinking that he could find the life he was supposed to have, the one where everything would finally make sense. But now, a sinking realization was creeping in. There was no such life. Every road had its own trials, its own disappointments. He couldn't escape the reality that hardship was woven into the fabric of every choice. Michael put the book back on the shelf, his fingers lingering on its spine for a moment. He felt the growing despair in his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. He had entered the library seeking freedom from his regrets, but instead, it seemed he was more trapped than ever. The search for the perfect life, the one free of pain and mistakes, had been an illusion all along. But even as that thought formed in his mind, a part of him still resisted. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. With a deep breath, he moved forward and reached for one last book. As Michael reached for the next book, he felt an inexplicable sense of finality. This one seemed different somehow, simpler in appearance, with no title on the spine, just like the others. But it had a weight to it that he hadn't noticed in the others. His hand lingered over the cover for a moment, as if some part of him knew that this book would offer something the others hadn't. With a deep breath, he opened it. What he found inside was startling. Unlike the other stories, this one didn't describe a completely different version of his life. Instead, it told the story of the life he was living right now. It was his story, with all the choices he had made. The ones that had led him to this very moment, standing in the mysterious library, reading about the alternate versions of himself. But as he turned the pages, Michael realized that this book also included something else. A life where he had made the one choice that he had always regretted not making. It was the decision that haunted him the most. The time he had been offered a job overseas, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and turned it down out of fear of the unknown. For years he had convinced himself that this was the choice that would have changed everything. That this was the decision that could have led him to the perfect life. Now, the book was showing him what might have happened if he had taken that opportunity. At first, the story unfolded like the dream he had always imagined. In this alternate life, Michael moved abroad, found great success in his new career, and lived a life filled with adventure and excitement. He met new people, traveled the world, and built a name for himself that he had always longed for. But as the pages turned, the cracks began to show. The job that once seemed like a dream started to become a burden, consuming all his time and energy. The distance from his family and friends left him feeling increasingly isolated, despite his outward success. Relationships fell apart, and the excitement he once felt was replaced by a deep sense of loneliness. Even in this version of his life, the one he had idealized for so long, there were still hardships, losses, and regrets. Michael's heart raced as he read the final pages. The book was showing him a truth that he hadn't been willing to face. Even the life he had believed would be perfect wasn't free from suffering. It wasn't the escape he had imagined. There was no life, no version of himself that didn't come with its own set of struggles. He closed the book gently, his mind reeling. For years, he had blamed that one decision for the discontent he felt in his life. He had convinced himself that if he had just made that one different choice, everything would have fallen into place. But now, standing in this endless library of possibilities, he understood the truth. There was no perfect path. No matter what choice he had made, no matter what road he took, there would always be challenges, and that was okay. The weight of his regrets, the burden he had carried for so long, began to lift. He no longer needed to search for a life that didn't exist. The life he had, with all its imperfections, was enough. Michael closed the book and placed it back on the shelf, his hands steady and calm for the first time in what felt like years. He wasn't afraid anymore. He didn't need to know what might have been. He was ready to accept the life he had lived and the choices he had made. Michael stood still for a moment, staring at the rows of books surrounding him. The once intimidating, endless shelves of stories no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, they seemed peaceful, like a reflection of the human experience. A maze of choices, full of paths, taken and not taken, each with its own mix of triumphs and hardships. The need to open another book, to search for a better answer, a clearer path, had finally left him. For the first time in years, Michael felt a sense of calm settle over him. His mind, which had been a storm of questions and regrets, was quiet now. The revelation from the last book lingered in his thoughts, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't heavy or burdensome. Instead, it felt freeing. There was no perfect choice, no flawless life waiting for him in the pages of these books or in the real world. And that simple truth lifted a weight he didn't even realize he had been carrying. He walked slowly around the library, no longer rushing to find the next story or the next answer. His gaze drifted over the countless books, but his curiosity had been satisfied. The library, which had once seemed like a place of endless possibilities, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where he had come to understand something about himself and about life. Michael sat down at a small wooden table near the center of the room. His mind wandered back over the choices he had made in his real life, the regrets he had once felt, the missed opportunities, the relationships that didn't last, the career moves he didn't make. All felt distant now, as if they no longer had power over him. He had always believed those choices had defined him, that they had limited what his life could have been. But now, he realized that those choices had made him who he was. And that was enough. The ache in his chest, the gnawing sense that he had taken the wrong path, faded. Every path, it turned out, was filled with both joy and sorrow. His life, with all its imperfections, was no different from the others. The illusion of perfection had finally been shattered, and in its place was something far more meaningful: acceptance. Michael smiled to himself, a small but genuine smile, as the tension in his shoulders melted away. For so long, he had been chasing a life that didn't exist, yearning for an ideal that was impossible. Now, he could finally let go. He had spent too much time dwelling on what might have been instead of appreciating what was. He stood up, ready to leave the library. There was no need to stay any longer. The answers he had been searching for were no longer hidden in the books around him. They had been within him all along, waiting for him to realize that life's beauty wasn't in the absence of challenges, but in the way one embraced them. Michael made his way back toward the door. He took one last look at the shelves that seemed to stretch forever. But this time, there was no urge to dive deeper into the stories of what could have been. He had what he needed. He was ready to move forward. Not into a different life, but into his own, with newfound peace. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open, stepping back into the cool night air. The street outside was the same as before, quiet and empty, but Michael felt like a different person. The burden of his past choices no longer weighed him down. He breathed deeply, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, and for the first time in years, he felt truly free. As Michael stepped out of the library and onto the quiet street, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The world felt different, though nothing around him had changed. The narrow street was still empty, the night still crisp and cool. But something within him had shifted. The weight of all those years, spent second-guessing and regretting the choices he had made, had vanished. In its place was a quiet contentment, not the kind born from a perfect life, but from an acceptance that no life, no matter how well planned, could ever be perfect. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, taking in his surroundings as if seeing them for the first time. For so long, Michael had been living in the past, replaying old decisions in his mind, convinced that he had missed out on something better. Now, he realized how much time he had wasted looking back, when all along, what truly mattered was the present. As he made his way back toward home, he thought about the small moments he had often overlooked, the simple pleasures of his daily routine, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, the conversations with friends that had once felt ordinary, but were, in fact, the essence of life. Those were the moments he had missed while chasing the illusion of a different, better life. Michael reached his apartment, stepping inside with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The familiar space no longer felt confining or disappointing. It was simply home. He sat down on his couch, glancing around the room, appreciating it for what it was. Not what it could have been or what he had once wished it was. There was no need to chase after imagined lives anymore. He was here, in this moment, and that was enough. As he sat in the quiet of his apartment, he reflected on the lessons the library had shown him. It wasn't that his choices didn't matter. They shaped who he was and where he had ended up. But the idea that one perfect decision could have saved him from all struggle or regret had been a lie. Each path came with its own set of difficulties, but also its own joys. And perhaps the real power came from embracing those ups and downs, rather than running from them. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the time that had always felt like it was slipping away from him. Now, though, Michael didn't feel the same urgency to race against it. Life would move forward, and so would he, without the heavy burden of regret holding him back. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streetlights flickered, and the occasional car passed by in the distance. It was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Life was happening all around him, just as it had been happening all these years while he had been stuck in his head, lost in thoughts of what if. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the cool air against his skin, and smiled to himself. He wasn't worried about what tomorrow would bring, or what the next big decision in his life would be. Whatever came, he would face it. Not with the fear of making the wrong choice, but with the understanding that every choice would be just another part of his journey. He had left the library behind, but its lessons had stayed with him. With that final thought, Michael turned away from the window, ready to live his life. Not in the shadow of what could have been, but in the light of what was.